I first became aware of Samantha Nutt through Denise Donlin. Is Denise in the house today, this afternoon? No, I saw her yesterday. Yeah, Denise? Ah, there you are, my dear. Okay, well, Denise was running Much Music at the time, and she had committed not only her own resources, but those of Much Music in support of something called War Child. It was the first time I came across it. War Child, an organization that works with people in the entertainment and music industries to help children caught in the middle of wars. Samantha mixes medical work abroad with consciousness raising at home. And I took note of this in the story I was reading about her, that a high school teacher of hers once wrote that this all-Canadian girl next door, she's a cutie pie, that, quote, she's a disruptive force in a sound environment. I like that. And today, I know we can say that, in fact, it's the reverse. She's a sound force in a disruptive environment who sees health as a way to get to the broader issues, which is to say, the human rights issues. Where is she? Samantha, there you are. Thank you.
Thank you and good evening. Actually, that was my physics teacher that called me a disruptive force. So I'm sure the irony isn't wasted on many of you in this crowd. Anyway, my name, as mentioned, is Samantha Nutt, and I'm a medical doctor. And I've spent the better part of the last 10 years working in zones of armed conflict, places like Burundi and Liberia, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, the Thai-Burmese border, the Congo, Sierra Leone, and northern Uganda. And I am the executive director of War Child Canada, which is a Canadian charity. And we work, as the name would suggest, in war-torn countries all around the world, helping kids. And we do that by providing health, education, and psychosocial support programs. But we also do that by working really hard with young Canadians right across the country to help get them involved in human rights causes, and also to get them thinking about their role in the world as good global citizens. And part of the way that we're able to do that is through an association that we have with the music community here in Canada, which we tribute to the wonderful passions of Denise Donlin, as Moses mentioned in the introduction, and also to the many artists that support our cause, including Chantal Kurbyazik and Rain Maida, Avril Lavigne, bands like Sum 41. But that's not what I'm here to talk about exclusively today, although obviously it's very, very important to me. But what I really want to talk to you about today, over the course of the next 18 minutes, is really this. This is a venue for us to talk about ideas. In fact, it says ideas that change the world. And inherent in that, implicit in that message, is a sense, to me, of idealism, of what we can all do to make this world a better place. And idealism is often seen as a derogatory word, but it isn't. In fact, for me, I couldn't do what I do when I get up every single day if I didn't believe that it was possible to make a difference. And the change that I want to see in the world is that I want to see the world become a better place for the millions of people, in fact, billions of people. An estimated 1/3 of the world's population is living in areas where there is active war, to make the world a better place for those civilians caught in the crossfire of war. What does this require? Well, it actually requires a dramatic shift in the global paradigm around war. It might sound like an empty platitude to some of you, so I'm going to explain what I mean by giving you a few field experiences. I was in Somalia in 1994, working for UNICEF, and I was based in Baidoa, which is in south-central Somalia. During the early 1990s, Baidoa was called the City of Death by Western journalists because 250,000 people died in that city. Starvation was still rampant throughout the country. Very few buildings remained intact. And war had destroyed virtually everything in its path. Schools were deserted, riddled with bullet holes. Health services had been driven to a halt. I was absolutely appalled by the sheer horror and the insecurity and absurdity of war. But by far, the most shocking thing for me, as a doctor and as a humanitarian, was the sheer number of guns in the country. AK-47s, rocket-propelled grenades, and machine guns were absolutely everywhere. Somalia was quite literally drowning in weapons. And where did those weapons come from? Well, they came from mostly China, Russia, and the United States. They're all locally available and at very low cost. So why does it matter? Why does it matter that there were so many guns in Somalia? It matters because gangs of teenage boys carrying automatic rifles thrived with impunity, killing and seizing whatever stood in their way. Somalia is no exception in that regard. In fact, in every country in which I have worked, I have come face to face with children, some as young as 8, who have never been to school, but who have fought and who have killed with Kalashnikov rifles. There are an estimated 70 million AK-47s in the world. They are virtually indestructible, and they can be purchased for as little as $6 on most illegal markets in Africa. In addition to that, some of you might be thinking, well, it was the early 90s. I can understand that there would have been a lot of weapons left in the country after the end of the Cold War. Well, in actual fact, we are currently supplying more weapons to developing countries than at any time in the past 5 years. 70% of all weapons sold right now are purchased by developing countries. And 90% of those come from the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Something to be ashamed of. So when you think about what it means to create a new paradigm around how we look at war, to change the way the world thinks about war, we need to think about how we are going to restrict the manufacturing and the supply of small and light weapons around the world. In 2004, we went to the Congo to film a documentary with the rock band Sum 41 about the impact of the war in that country. The war in the Congo has left an estimated 3 million civilians dead since 1997. It is considered the deadliest war in African history and the worst war in terms of the numbers of civilians killed since World War II. Now, while we were in the country, we interviewed a number of different people impacted by the war, but also some of the kids who had been involved in waging war. And what's important to note here is that an estimated 50% of those fighting in the war in the Congo are children under the age of 16. And while we were in the country, tensions escalated. We were based in the town of Bukavu, and eventually we were forced to flee across the border ourselves with a number of other civilians. Now I'm going to run an audio clip from the documentary that we produced because it's really important when you think about war that you don't just see the stories, that you hear them and that you feel them, because that is the agony of what it means to survive in a conflict zone. Can you run the clip, please?
On évalue la situation ensemble pour voir comment est-ce que nous pouvons obtenir très rapidement l'arrêt des tirs. Et ensemble, avec les autorités militaires, nous souhaiterions savoir qu'est-ce qui est en train de se passer, pourquoi cette guerre, elle vise quoi, quels sont ses objectifs, parce que nous la considérons comme une guerre inutile.
It'd been about a half an hour of just silence, and it felt like, oh, okay, good, maybe it's over. And people were, going out of the rooms and sitting outside and just talking, and we were feeling pretty good. By that point, we were making jokes, and then out of nowhere, this huge mortar just went off.
So we'll be in touch.
It hit so close that dust started falling off the ceiling.
We gotta go back inside this.
War, it's so unpredictable, and you have no idea. I mean, at one point, it sounded like it was really far away, and then 10 minutes later, it sounds like it's right outside the door. And then Chuck came running down saying, we all gotta get out, and he was yelling to his walkie-talkie saying, we need an evacuation, and he needs tanks to come, and that's when I really thought, now it's over. This is how we're gonna die.
Okay, ready? I'm gonna call you groups of 1 to 10. Now what's gonna happen is I'm gonna be calling you guys upstairs into the main lobby. You ready? Now this is very important.
I was just thinking of everything we've done as a band and just everything I've done as a person. I'm just like, well, this is it. This is how it ends.
Number 9. Number 10. Next group, come on up. Now get closest to the door, group number 1. You've never done this before. Number 1. Go. Number 2. Go. We received 2 mortar rounds.
It's still hard for me to listen to that and not shake. But the reason why I wanted you to hear that is because there are people all around the world who are living with war, and the psychological impact that has on your daily existence is almost unfathomable, I think, to many of us here until we have lived it ourselves, and hopefully most of us never will. But what is important about the Congo, and there are many things that are important, but what is important is that the heart of the war in the Congo lies an international, and I'll say international because at various points in time it has included the participation of at least 6 neighboring countries, an international struggle to control the country's vast resources. And this has been happening historically in the Congo, from the Belgians to Mobutu, and the instability as well that was created by the mass exodus of refugees from Rwanda during the genocide. But at the heart of the war in the Congo lies a struggle to control many minerals, precious stones, metal, and timber. And of particular importance to the industrialized world, to many of us, is a little-known mineral called coltan, which is found in many of our cell phones, video game consoles, and computers. A couple of years ago, a UN panel of experts investigated 114 companies and 54 individuals who were in violation of OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises in association with the war in the Congo. Some of these violations included companies supplying arms to rebel and foreign forces, companies relying on the services of rebel and foreign forces in order to mine minerals out of the Congo, and companies buying minerals from the Congo without conducting due diligence tests as to where those minerals came from. A global shift in the paradigm around war requires all of us to understand how our actions, directly and indirectly, can contribute to the suffering of millions of people around the world. And coltan is just one example. The war in Sierra Leone and the war in Uganda, the war in Angola, those are wars that have been principally fought to control diamonds. And conflict diamonds, or blood diamonds, make up about 5 to 10% of the world's diamonds. There is an international process of certification that has been underway for many years, and it should be routine for any of you to go into a diamond store and demand a certificate of origin, and yet it isn't. I'm going to give you another example about our connection to war. In 2003, my husband and I, who's also a medical doctor, we worked together, we were on our way into Iraq about 2 days after the fall of Saddam's statue in Al Fardous Square. And we found ourselves at the home of a very dear friend of ours. Her name was Akila al-Hashimi. And as we sat in her living room drinking tea, her 2 little nieces scattered about the house. They were 6 and 8. And they were practicing their French, because Akila, who is a civil servant with the Department of Foreign Affairs in Baghdad, she had a degree in French literature from the Sorbonne. And she had promised her nieces that now that the war was over, that the sanctions would end, and she was going to take the little girls to Paris. And as we sat in her home, Akila turned to us and she said, "I feel as if the last 30 years have been confiscated from me. First by Saddam, then by the Iran-Iraq war, then by the sanctions and the US-led war in 1991, and now the most recent war." And she said, "I hope it's over, because I am ready to live my life." A few months later, Akila would be one of only 3 women appointed to the interim Iraqi Governing Council. And a few months after that, my husband and I were lying in bed in the middle of the night, and we received a phone call. And it was a journalist friend of ours. "Turn on the news," she said. "Akila has been shot." And we turned to the BBC, and they were running footage from Akila's driveway, and it was covered in blood, and there were 2 little girls standing at the side crying. And a few months after that, we watched a dear friend of ours, Margaret Hassan of the aid agency Care International, beg for her life in a videotape message that aired on all the major news networks. They died because of the ease of availability of weapons in Iraq, including AK-47s, that make it possible for any pathological entrepreneur to grab a gun and make money off of coercion and kidnapping. But they also died because of something that's been happening very recently in our line of work, but particularly over the last 10 years. They died because of a gradual blurring of the margins, blurring of the lines between the military and between humanitarian operations. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the military has engaged consistently in a public relations exercise to win the hearts and win the minds of local people, and they have done that by engaging in things that are traditionally the domain of humanitarian actors. Food distributions, provision of hospitals, provision of health services, and the like. It started in Somalia. It was made worse during the bombings in Kosovo, where NATO set up refugee camps behind most of the armed force areas. It continues in Afghanistan, and it continues in Iraq. I'm not talking about peacekeeping. I'm not talking about what Erwin referred to earlier in terms of a United Nations sanctioned protection force. Those are not the same things. But a dramatic shift in the paradigm around war requires a concerted effort to maintain and protect a neutral humanitarian space. And so you might be thinking, well, what can I do? What are the steps that are necessary? Well, there are a few of them, and I'm going to give you a couple in my remaining 50 seconds. Number one is we need to invest as a country, but also as a global community, in preventing war and not in waging war. Annual worldwide military spending is approximately $1 trillion. That was for 2005. By comparison, overseas development assistance was 1/20th this amount. We need to spend more on rebuilding health, education, and social infrastructure, and in the promotion of good governance. For that matter, number two is we need to encourage Canadians, and all of Canada really, to step up. Right now, our overseas development assistance is at 0.27%. The target of 0.7% was set by our very own Lester B. Pearson. We are 14th in the world in terms of our contributions to ODA, and that is unacceptable. We need to end the culture of impunity, which is also something that Erwin referred to, and also William Sampson. What does that mean? Well, in my mind, that means continuing our support for institutions such as the International Criminal Court. Number four, we need to aggressively address the AIDS pandemic worldwide, because when we talk about security, with 40 million people living with AIDS and 15 million AIDS orphans, we cannot talk about security without thinking about the impact that this will have not only on current generations, but on future generations. Number five, we need non-governmental organizations to do a better job of communicating the impact of war globally, and to do that in a way that is constructive. The images that you see on television that alienate you from the child who's living through war, in the end, those are more destructive than constructive, and that practice needs to end. Number six is we need to take this issue to the boardrooms, and this is something that you're better equipped to do than I am. Corporate social responsibility begins and ends with all of you. It needs to be a part of your practice in everything that you do from a business perspective. I think I'm at number seven. Number seven is the media. And again, I'm not as equipped to handle this as many of you, but I think when Peter Mansbridge gets bumped by an idol wannabe show on the CBC of all institutions, I don't know, I spent all day yesterday looking to see if the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse were behind me. That's got to change. Sometimes you have to give the people what they need and not necessarily what they want. Number 9 is we need to continue supporting, or number 8, we need to continue supporting the work of the United Nations. It may be flawed, it may be imperfect, but it's the best that we got. And number 9 is we need to continue to invest, not just in one child at a time, but in one community at a time. It may feel good to have a picture of your child on your fridge. It'll feel better when you have a picture of a school. And finally, we need to stop ceding to this notion that life and loss are inherently more relevant over here than over there. Because our actions, whether it's the cell phones that we use, the cars that we drive, the gas that we put in those cars, the diamonds that we buy, all of those actions unwittingly send this message. And all of our inactions, from Rwanda to northern Uganda to the Congo to Darfur, they reinforce that message. People all around the world deserve dignity and they deserve respect. And it is time for us to give children, whether they live here or whether they live in Africa or Iraq or Afghanistan, those children deserve the same level of attention, concern, and protection as their own children here at home. Thank you.